I invite Mr. Peter Maurer, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, to give a short presentation. And I would also express the OSCPA's condolences at the recent loss of your colleague in Ukraine. It is a loss to all of our work. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, dear colleagues, thanks a lot for the condolences. I will also pass them to colleagues and families. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to address this assembly today. The ICRC and the OSCE have very different mandates. In a nutshell, you seek to prevent conflicts. We seek to ease its impact, but our work still overlaps in many areas. The OSCE is unique in bringing together an unparalleled amount of political actors with large bandwidth of options and positions. You thereby represent a forum in which future security challenges can be thought through and eventually addressed. In particular, the fact that US parliamentarians are discussing here is of crucial importance. Still too often, parliaments and parliamentarians do not play the full role they should be able to play when it comes to debating security and humanitarian issues and linking international challenges to national legislative processes. I'm here today to talk about new security challenges and the ICRC, and thus to offer a distinct humanitarian perspective to your debates. Let me therefore just start with a few remarks on our two institutions. The three key dimensions in the OSCE's work, security, economic, and human, are critical for the ICRC too. Through our work within armed conflicts, we are close to your security dimension. Our support of livelihoods relates to the economic and our mandate to mitigate the impact of conflicts to the human dimension. All OSCE members are also high contracting parties to the Geneva Conventions. You own the Geneva Conventions, the ICRC is only its custodian. And with the Geneva Conventions comes the collective responsibility to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law. So the OSCE and the ICRC both have to work hand in hand to protect and strengthen international humanitarian law. But we also have operations in the same regions, notably in Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. And our work overlaps when we think about so-called frozen conflicts or protracted conflicts, as we call them, such as in the Caucasus or the Balkans, or when we work on issues like missing persons or on population displacements and migration. Both of our organizations are strongly determined by normative work and policy consensus, but there are also clear distinctions. The OSCE is a political, the ICRC is a humanitarian organization. You have all been elected and you have a responsibility towards your constituencies. Your mandate is to build a safer world based on sustainable political solutions. The ICRC is an impartial, neutral, and independent organization whose exclusively humanitarian mandate is to protect the lives and dignity of victims of armed conflict and other situations of violence, and to provide them with assistance and ensure protection. The ICRC does not shape the future. Its mission is to ease the impact of armed conflict and violence in the present, and thus to assist and protect victims of conflict. We work to prevent abuses within conflict, but we cannot prevent conflict beyond engaging for the prevention of violations of IHL. That is a political job, your job, ladies and gentlemen. So we work on some of the same issues and we work in the same contexts. Our roles are different, but they are largely complementary. While you make an effort to integrate different perspectives, our focus is to keep the humanitarian perspective separate from the other agendas and to allow the greatest possible acceptance by parties to conflict and ensure the largest possible access to all those in need. The OSCE is aspirational, trying to build and form security and cooperation. The ICRC seeks full respect for applicable norms and preserves a minimum of shared humanity in conflict. Again, the OSCE seeks to prevent conflict. The ICRC seeks to prevent the most serious abuses in conflict. Let me just turn to new security challenges. As a humanitarian actor, the ICRC has a distinct perspective on new and emerging security challenges, which are often not really new, but a complex combination of old and new factors. 6 areas are of particular concern to us. Firstly, the changing global environment. Armed violence today takes place in a context of evolving international power structures and therefore changing patterns of influence in internal and international conflict dynamics. This forces the ICRC to considerably enlarge its engagement with states who are at the same time high contracting parties to the Geneva Conventions. At the same time, many emerging countries have capacities and capabilities which are made available to international relief operations, thus increasing the necessity for cooperation and coordination and the potential for mutual support in these efforts. In that sense, the ICRC has considerably enlarged its interaction with emerging countries and non-traditional donors in the last couple of years. Secondly, we have been witnessing the emergence of new actors in today's battlefields. New and often fragmented groups with unclear chains of commands and structures and extremist postures force us to considerably scale up our capacities for engagement. Many of these new actors have at the same time access to the same weapons and strategic skills for warfare and communication capacities as states. The number of armed groups leads to increasingly destructured conflicts in these new contexts, different violent mixes, conflict-driven, criminal, intercommunal violence. Moreover, warfare happens more often in urban areas, thus affecting larger numbers of civilians. Together, this leads to a transformation of our operational environment and challenges us. How to draw these actors to abide by the existing laws and to conduct of hostilities that are guiding international humanitarian law. Thirdly, we see the shapes of the battlefield changing. Conventional armed conflict is amplified by the easy availability of arms and the addition of new means and methods of warfare. Cyber warfare, remote use of weapons, covert operations, or militarized policing are relatively new phenomenon. The geographic areas of the application of IHL and in armed conflict are increasingly difficult to define. Drone strike in Yemen and Somalia, bombardment in Syria. How do we frame these in terms of international humanitarian law? Fourthly, we see the deepening and expansion of conflict dynamics which transform national dynamics and their humanitarian impact increasingly into regional and global threats. Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Sahel or Sub-Saharan Africa, even the Ukraine, we witness a trend from temporary disruption to protracted conflict to regional system disintegration in terms of health, water, sanitation, nutrition, habitat, and education. So the old traditional protracted conflicts are somehow compounded by new emerging conflicts which have increasingly regional dimensions in terms of the system disintegrations I mentioned beforehand. And in those new dynamics, we increasingly are aware of recurring issues of violence and violations of law, like sexual violence or violence against healthcare workers and health facilities, which need different qualities of response than just temporary relief. We are fifthly observing an erosion of the capabilities of conflict-affected states to provide essential services to populations. Long-term protracted conflicts erode state capacities. And finally, we see that social media and global interconnectedness add pressure and speed that can exacerbate conflicts and create additional constraints. I would like to illustrate these challenges that we are confronted with some questions and contextual remarks. How to negotiate security and access today, how to engage with a multiplicity of unstructured armed groups, like in the Ukraine or Syria, where we have hundreds of armed groups, or Iraq, where we have particularly radical armed groups, or Afghanistan, where again we have had for the last 10 years a Taliban movement in control of large parts of the countries. How to adequate international humanitarian law in such contexts? Who is a combatant and who is a civilian? And what is direct participation in hostility and therefore a legitimate target? What is the legal framework for exceeding detainees in non-international armed conflict, as we are increasingly confronted with the fact that those non-state armed groups are taking detainees in combats? How do we address the fact that we may have an incomplete legal basis for new methods of warfare, like cyber warfare or remote warfare? How should we cope with the urbanization of warfare and the particularly challenging application of the rules of war and the use of weapons and ammunition in urban environments and densely populated areas? How to protect civilians in protracted situations of violence below the threshold of international humanitarian law? In that context, how to manage the interaction of international humanitarian law and human rights law? And how do we address increasingly regional and global challenges with national response structures that inform still the most dominant way on how we respond to crises? You are members of legislative bodies and you know how difficult it is to make sure that legislations and policies are up to date with realities. We face the same struggle with international humanitarian law and humanitarian diplomacy. Is the legal framework that base our operations sufficient? And how do we ensure that existing norms are respected by belligerents and political authorities? By and large, and over the last decades, the international community is responding to the broader and deeper challenges by a strong integration of peace, human rights, development, and humanitarian agendas. Your organization is a typical example of this trend. Humanitarian action is often integrated into more comprehensive response systems, functions as a replacement of the lack of political solution, or humanitarian action is politicized and instrumentalized as confidence-building steps in a broader, comprehensive framework. ICRC has taken issue with such approach, in particular in sensitive conflict-ridden areas and context of emergencies, as they come at the price of complicating or preventing access, politicizing a shared space of humanity, marginalizing or antagonizing parties who do not share some of the political visions of an integrated international response, and restraining avenues of collaboration and engagement. We have therefore advocated in favor of keeping the implementation and development of IHL, as well as humanitarian action in emergencies and crisis situations, clearly distinct from some of the more ambitious and more political agendas of the international community. Let me just mention very briefly few of our approaches which ICRC has chosen to respond to the challenges mentioned. We have engaged over the last 2 years to a distinct process of strengthening implementation and mechanisms for implementation of international humanitarian law by creating a regular meeting of high contracting parties. We are engaged in different processes of clarification of the law, different initiatives at different levels, on detention in non-international armed conflict, on clarification through expert-driven processes on weapons and battlefields, to address with specific legal policy and advocacy processes the issues I mentioned, healthcare in danger, sexual violence, and many more. Such distinct processes do not mean that we are not ready and willing to exchange, coordinate, and eventually cooperate with other institutions, but that we have a more ambitious and stringent requirement for consensus building in order to ensure acceptance and implementation of the law and security and access for our staff on the ground in an increasingly complex environment. Let me just make one concluding remark. With evolving power shifts, conflict patterns, and response systems, the humanitarian space can be expanded, but the truth is that humanitarian action and the ICRC within it has limits. When politics cannot prevent or stop conflict, the minimum we need from you is that you ensure that humanitarians have the necessary political space to help victims without discrimination, that we can fulfill our mandate in the best possible conditions, without being instrumentalized, with the greatest access possible, and with the highest security guarantees possible. The ICRC would greatly welcome if there was a political commitment that states embrace their responsibility for conflict resolution, which is ultimately the best response for putting an end to human suffering. And we appreciate parliamentarian support for national and international legislative frameworks which allow us to better cope with the new security environment and its impact. I thank you, Mr. President.